Production funding is brought to you in part by A. Reddix & Associates, a healthcare management consulting firm bridging the gap between healthcare policy and the community through education, training, and outreach. Find out more at ardx.net. Discussing the issues and celebrating the successes of the African American community. This is Another View.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Since we live in a resort area, I'm sure you've had plenty of relatives and friends who want to visit during the summer. If you're looking for places to go after you've had your fill of sand and surf, this is the show for you. Tonight, our guests will show us places that highlight Black history right here in Hampton Roads. Please welcome Mae Breckenridge-Haywood, President of the African American Historical Society of Portsmouth, Dr. Robert Watson, Assistant History Professor at Hampton University, and Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, History Professor at Norfolk State University. Welcome to Another View, everybody.
Thank you.
So we're going to take a little trip around Hampton Roads and talk about some of the historical things that happen right here in Hampton Roads that highlight Black history and that people can check out as they go along. Now, WHRO did this brochure. It's called African American History Comes Alive, and we'll tell you how to get a copy a little bit later on in the show. But Robert, you helped us to edit some of the local points and to give us some history behind them. How was that experience for you?
It was a great experience. I think the best part for me was finding out that there are people who have really, at this point, have begun to understand and study and research and visit places where African American history is known to be. So that was the rewarding part for me. The research was interesting as well, because I found out a lot of things about places here that I didn't know about.
That you weren't even aware of. See,
Absolutely.
That's a good thing. Now, one of the things that's not on here, but I'm going to start talking about it first, Cassandra, I'm going to go to you, is about the Underground Railroad. There were actual stops in Hampton Roads, one of which is the Dismal Swamp. And our Lisa Godley went recently, or a little while ago, to do a story about the Dismal Swamp and about it being named as one of the locations. So let's take a look at that.
Often exhausted to the point of collapse, but determined to be free, many fugitive slaves sought refuge here, the Great Dismal Swamp. Wooded areas like this served as great hiding places as well as a very good food source. Some historians estimate that between 1,000 and 40,000 escaped slaves once lived in the Dismal Swamp. Archaeologist Dan Sayers spends a lot of time in the Dismal Swamp these days. He hopes to find pieces of tools or parts of structures that slaves used to survive.
Some people came through here and found these communities of African Americans already here. They stayed with them for a short term, and then they figured out their way they're going to get north outside of this general slave system of the South. But others joined those communities, and they grew and grew.
The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made living here even more frightening than the hardships nature alone could ever inflict. The law enabled owners to hunt down slaves anywhere in the United States and bring them back to the plantation. But it's the stories of the slaves themselves and wanted posters circulated by their owners that show the swamp's role in aiding those on the run. James Blunt from Isle of Wight County posted an ad offering $100 reward for my man Bonaparte. He says, "I have received information that he's lurking about in the Dismal Swamp." Historian Tommy Boger says there's record of one escaped slave who raised her children in the swamp, teaching them to only speak in whispers and walk quickly and quietly. Even after they were captured and brought back to the plantation in Chesapeake, then Norfolk County, the children's behavior didn't change.
The kids would never run across the yard or walk straight across the yard. They had been conditioned to walk a few steps, stop, look around, walk a few steps, stop, look around.
Some historians believe entire generations were raised in the swamp. They turned what their owners deemed inhospitable terrain into their home. And whether that meant days, weeks, months, or even years here, it was the preferred alternative to a life of bondage. For Another View, I'm Lisa Godley.
Cassandra, what else have we found out about the Dismal Swamp and what was going on as part of the Underground Railroad?
Well, you know, when Dan Sayers was talking, he quickly mentioned that some people really just passed through the swamp. Many of them on their way to the harbor area of Norfolk and Portsmouth, and others actually made their home in the swamp. And depending upon what you could tolerate would depend upon what you did. Many of them actually were just passing through the swamp.
And you said they went to Norfolk and Portsmouth.
Right, because this was the big port area. In fact, Norfolk was the harbor of Norfolk was the place where a lot of goods and services from eastern North Carolina were brought. And of course, they were put aboard ships, usually steamships or barges, and went to the north. There were regular ships and schooners coming in every year, going to Philadelphia mostly, and to Boston, and then later on to New York.
Are there other places that people can visit today where the slaves went as they tried to make their way north?
Well, you know, there's been so much renovation of the harbor area in Portsmouth and in Norfolk that you can point them to certain areas, and this is what the Norfolk Visitors and Convention Bureau has done. I've worked with them to create an interactive website that shows you the departure points for a lot of enslaved people. For example, many of them who didn't leave aboard a schooner over there in Portsmouth, they would leave from the North Street Ferry and come over to Norfolk, and there were lots and lots of schooners as well as steamships that left from Norfolk. Then after 1856, they closed that ferry down, the North Street Ferry, because it was too isolated. So then they moved it to the High Street area, and the High Street Ferry is really where the ferry going from Portsmouth to Norfolk is still in operation.
It's still in operation today.
And so they were really leaving from like the area of Waterside down to where you see Commercial Street. That's the area where there were a lot of schooners that docked, and we know that people like Captain Alfred Fountain had his schooner there, and he had a secret compartment, and he put slaves aboard.
Now, Portsmouth being another key place, and as president of the African American Historical Society, Emmanuel.
I just wanted to add that in some of the research that I've done along with Dr. Newby-Alexander, we did find that the church, Emmanuel AME Church, was one of the areas that we call a lookout area that many of the slaves escaped from. They lived in Portsmouth, but they had to go from the waterfront of Portsmouth over to Norfolk. But in the appellant book, William Still's Underground Railroad, we were able to identify many of the people that actually lived in Portsmouth, attended Emmanuel AME, and escaped to freedom in Philadelphia. And that church, Historical Emmanuel AME, located on North Street,
still today, people can go there.
Still today is very important for African Americans to go and see this historic church.
And if you also at Emmanuel, not just at Emmanuel, but there's also a historic cemetery in Portsmouth.
Absolutely.
Tell us about that.
That cemetery is called currently the Mount Calvary Complex, but it's a group of several cemeteries. There's Mount Calvary, Mount Olive, Fisher's Hill, and a Potter's Field. That cemetery was actually started in 1879 by a group of ex-slaves. They got together, pulled their funds, and purchased a small piece of land, a group of them, and this is where many of the first African Americans outside of the church cemeteries that were close to the churches and many homes people were buried in. But this was the first formal burial grounds for African Americans. And very recently, well, over the course of years, the cemetery has become unkept and people are not taking care of it. It was privately owned earlier too, that families buried their dead there. And many times the families would gather. One celebration was during Memorial Day. There were actually 2 parades in Portsmouth, and one was for the white population, which was on High Street. And the other parade during Memorial Day started at Effingham Street and went to South Street and went to this historic cemetery, which is Mount Calvary, Mount Olive. And I understand there was a very gay time. They had someone who headed the parade, and I understand is one of the prominent funeral directors, Mr. Fisher. And he would have a top hat on, and of course it was not the days where you had modern transportation, so it was a horse and buggy, and he would lead the parade, and many of the parade revelers would follow the parade onto the cemetery. And they had some semblance of a program. Someone spoke, and they placed memorial wreaths or flowers on the graves. And it was a day also that the families whitewashed the funerals, not the funerals, but the
headstones?
The headstones, excuse me, the headstones. So yes, that cemetery is very, very historical.
One of the things, and I ask this of all of you, because as historians, the 3 of you, when you see something like this cemetery that has fallen into disrepair, what does that make you feel like? Because you all are the keepers of history. How does that affect you?
Well, it affects me in a very emotional way, because as the 3 of us and many people realize that Africans were generally not memorialized in terms of being recognized through a headstone. And so the fact that many of these cemeteries have fallen in such dilapidated state is shameful, because there was no real recognition when they were here and died, and now there's no real recognition when there ought to be, and I think it's our responsibility to make certain that that does not happen. But let me just go back very quickly to the comments about the Dismal Swamp. I think one of the other stories that's oftentimes lost in the discussion of the Dismal Swamp is that these were places, as Dr. Newby-Alexander pointed out and Tommy pointed out in his piece, was that these were places where you have a very high retention of Africanisms, where people remembered things that they could remember from Africa that was passed down. And so the Dismal Swamp serves that purpose as well as a place such as, I would say, Palmeiras in northeastern Brazil, where you have a similar geographical situation where slaves ran off to be free. And that's where you have the highest retention of Africanism, those cultural beliefs, those practices that they could remember from Africa as they were being passed on. So I think that's one of the stories that we oftentimes don't mention.
And those, by the way, those were the blacks who actually stayed there, not the ones who were just
went through,
passing
but the ones who actually lived there.
Right, and it also, so much of that was lost by the end of the antebellum period, because once then slavery was ended, many people then left that area and settled outside of the swamp because it was so difficult to live in the swamp. And I also wanted to just follow up with one thing that Mae was saying, that for those who are visiting Portsmouth, the old Glasgow Street Church, which the Black Methodists used until it was burned down in 1857, I believe. That church was where a lot of people that William still talked about actually attended, and then they built the current church. And at that time, you know, it didn't become an AME church until into the 1860s, almost 1870, because churches had to be a part of the white denominational group. They were not allowed after Nat Turner's rebellion to be a separate entity, even though there were a few, not in this area, few in the South, like in Charleston, South Carolina, the one that Denmark Vesey attended. That was an AME church, but after 1831, no churches in the South that were black churches were allowed to either be separate from a white denomination or to have a black minister.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Emancipation Oak?
Emancipation Oak, one of the 10 most important trees, are what I call a living artifact in the world, according to the National Geographic Society, is located on Hampton University campus. The importance of Emancipation Oak, other than it being a symbol of freedom, is that it was, according to the research, the first place in the South where the Emancipation Proclamation was read on the 1st of January 1863. And that's a great symbolic gesture that people from all over the world come there to see. And unfortunately, students who come to Hampton oftentimes don't go to Emancipation Oak until maybe their senior year, or until they become an alumni, which I think is not a good thing. I took a group of my pre-college students there this morning, and they were amazed, of course, at the size of the tree, but more amazed about the history. And I still think that that's a story that's, for the most part, not known, but it's a very important living artifact in terms of African American history.
Another place on the peninsula, Newsom House.
Yes.
And that was a very highbrow
yes,
house owned by an African American.
Right, owned by a journalist, a lawyer, a civic leader, Joseph Newsom, who was from Sussex, born in 1869, died in 1942. But the years that he lived in Newport News were an interesting time for black folks. It was an interesting time in America. And I think if you studied Newsom House, I studied Newsom and the house, which is also just a marvelous piece of architecture, tells one a lot about just how he had achieved, what he had achieved, and what he aspired for others to achieve in Virginia. I took a group of students there recently too, and they were surprised that he was a Republican, and I had to remind them.
Forget that that was the party of choice.
That was the party of choice back then, and that there were people like Maggie Walker and Booker T. Washington and some others who were Republicans, primarily because it was a party of Lincoln, and so they were eager to learn more. And I think that's one of the things that the Emancipation Oak, the Dismal Swamp, and some of the other places that we're talking about here are so important for people to know about, because these people and places made significant impact on the American psyche. And they're great places to visit and learn.
While we're still on the peninsula, because there's a bunch of things on the peninsula as well as the south side, but Aberdeen Gardens, that was a neighborhood that was built specifically for African Americans.
Right, 1934.
By African Americans, right?
In 1934, with the help of the federal government, it was one of those, and Cassandra probably knows quite a bit about this as well, but it was one of those planned neighborhoods, an area where houses were built for the people who would come and work in the industries in Newport News. And it's a well-planned neighborhood where people became independently wealthy to some degree in terms of
home ownership.
Right, of home ownership. It was a place where people would receive visitors from the broader community as an example of what black folks could do with some help.
And they had indoor plumbing, didn't they?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Well, you know, this area has 4 historic government-funded communities. One, the first one, Hilton Village, that was actually funded both by the Huntington Shipyard and the federal government. Most of the time when people think about government funded housing.
Right, they
think of low-income housing that started in the 40s, but these houses started to help the shipyards because these were critical periods. The 19-teens, this was the World War I period. Aberdeen Gardens, that was the beginning of the wars that would eventually lead up to the Second World War. And so you had one white and one black on the peninsula housing area that was for the government workers, primarily in the shipyards. And then here on the south side in Portsmouth, you had Truxton and you had Craddock that were to provide housing for the blacks who worked in the shipyard, the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Portsmouth. And these were all modern houses. They all, or most of them, had indoor plumbing. The problem, of course, was that at least for Truxton, the federal government did not actually finish what they started. They cut the funding because the war ended. And so they really didn't finish all the things that they were supposed to finish in that one. But in Aberdeen Gardens, they did.
They did finish that. Mae, I want to ask you about the building for the African American Historical Society, because you're doing something that was done before. Explain to our viewers.
I'm so thrilled that you did ask me about it. The building that you're speaking of, it was called the Portsmouth Community Library. The building is the first library that was built specifically for African Americans in the city of Portsmouth. And the society that I represent, the African American Historical Society, is currently restoring that building into a museum. And I think it's important for the community and especially students to know the history of a particular place, because sacrifices were made. And although it's a tiny building, it's only 900 square feet, and it has been moved 2 times. It was once on South Street, moved from South Street just to the back of a lot, which was right beside a church, Ebenezer Baptist Church, a historical church. But the church became displeased that the building was there, and possibly it was a money issue of trying to keep it up since they were not physically using the building. So very recently, within the last couple of years, the Historical Society went into a memorandum of agreement with the city to, the city would move the building and put it on city property, and the Historical Society would renew the restore the interior. And it's been an arduous task, but we are making it happen. The Historical Society have managed to get grants to renovate the interior. And very recently we started a new campaign which we launched in February. And that campaign is called High Five for History. The campaign is modeled after an earlier campaign when the library was first built in 1944. At that time, the the citizens, black and white, asked for funding to purchase the lots for the building. And they had this campaign, and they asked the citizens to give $1 to buy the lots. And it was just 2 lots, which were purchased at a cost of about $2,500. And the lots were purchased by the community, and the city had the building erected, put on that
And so
lot.
now you're asking people to give $5.
To give $5 for history for the principle of restoring that building. So it's been a very popular campaign, and people have been giving. We have a connection with a California person. He doesn't live here, but his roots are here, and he's sending out communications to his fraternity brothers and all of his connections, community connections and organizational connections. And we've actually gotten a contribution through his connection from the Virgin Islands.
Oh, fantastic. We've got excited. 1 minute left. I want you guys to talk to our viewers about visiting these places and patronizing them, those that are museums and so forth, and why that's so important. Cassandra, like 10 seconds, tell them why.
Because that's where history was made. If you go to the cemeteries such as West Point Cemetery or Calvary Cemetery in Norfolk or Mount Olive Cemetery in Portsmouth or Veterans Cemetery in Hampton, you'll see the markers of prominent blacks who made a difference, who were the publishers of newspapers, who were the physicians who helped to start the major hospitals in this area. And to forget these individuals, even though the cities, a lot of these are public cemeteries and the cities neglected them. And the community needs to know this is where your history is located. This is where the people who made a difference, they're remembered in these places, and we shouldn't forget.
We should not forget them too. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're out of time. But if you would like a copy of the African American History Comes Alive in Hampton Roads, call WHRO at 757-889-9437, and we'll be happy to send it. Or you can download it from our website at WHRO.org. And we'll be right back after we take a look at what's happening in Hampton Roads. And thanks for joining us this evening. Visit anotherview.tv and sign up for our eView newsletter. And we're on Facebook, so we hope you'll become a fan. We'll see you next week for Another View.
Production funding is brought to you in part by A. Reddix & Associates, a healthcare management consulting firm bridging the gap between healthcare policy and the community through education, training, and outreach. Find out more at ardx.net.